It's time to ask yourself some questions. Are you a World War II nerd? Are you someone who knows a lot about tanks and fighting vehicles used in World War II? Or are you someone who just really doesn't know a lot about vehicles and hell it loose? The answer is probably no, or you're here to check a couple things and review some stuff. In Hell Let Loose, there is a wide array of vehicles ranging from trucks to tanks to jeeps to a lot of things that can influence the battlefield in different ways. But the problems lay in the fact that many people either don't know the names of the vehicles, know the vehicles themselves in general, or can correctly identify them when, say, talking to command chat when reporting their positions. So in this video, we're going to try and rectify some of those issues by presenting all the different vehicles in the game, what faction they belong to, and their names that they can be called in-game. That way, when you're out in the battlefield and you see these vehicles, you can properly report them to whoever you need to report them to, whether that be a squad lead or a command chat. To start off with, I want to talk about the more non-combat rolled vehicles or lighter vehicles, such as transport trucks, supply trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks. Now, just a little bit of background on these vehicles. These vehicles are meant to be logistical. They're meant to either ferry people into combat, deliver supplies to the front lines, or in the half-tracks case, deliver a mobile spawn to the front lines. The only vehicle that can provide any sort of offensive ability in terms of actual firepower is the half-track with the machine gun on top of it. But besides the half-track, every other vehicle is completely unarmed. Now, each of the factions has a vehicle to serve each of these roles, and they're not in particular any better than any other factions. The only difference between any of the vehicles may be the half-tracks, which we'll get to. But with that, I want to break down each of the vehicles now, starting with the transport trucks. Simply put, the transport truck is built for ferrying men into combat. The truck can hold up to 12 people, including the driver. And right here is the US's example of the transport truck. The German transport truck. The Soviet Union's transport truck. Finally, the British transport truck. Up next, we have the supply truck. This essentially is just a transport truck with a canvas top on the back of it. It brings in 2 supply crates of 150 supplies each to be delivered on the front line. And this is the US's example of the supply truck. The German supply truck. The Soviet Union's supply truck. And lastly, the British supply truck. Moving on from the trucks, we have a small vehicle called the Jeep. Now, each faction has one of these. They're very small 4-man transports that are very fast, very mobile. They drop ammo boxes, but besides that, that's all they really do. And this is the US's Jeep in question. From there, we have the Kolbwagen, or basically the German Jeep. Basically, their version of the small vehicle that shares a different name. Next, we have the Soviet Union Jeep called the Gaz-67. Looks pretty similar to the Willys Jeep that the Americans and British have. And last, we have the British Jeep, which is essentially just a Willys Jeep, but slightly altered to make it look different. The last slight vehicle I want to talk about is the half-track, a armored and armed vehicle that can act as a spawn once it is stopped and the engine is off. The US, British, and Soviet half-tracks are all basically the same, so I'm not going to waste time with the panoramic shots. The only real difference of them is the different decals and paint jobs, but they're all exactly the same. Meanwhile, the Germans do have a different half-track. The turn is different, it doesn't go 360 degrees, but it serves the same purpose. It just looks different. So here's the German half-track now. Let's get to the thing that you actually are probably here for, the tanks. The metal behemoths that can make or break a battle. Now, each country currently in the game does have at least one tank under each category, which is the following: recon tanks, light tanks, medium tanks, and heavy tanks. Now, this is where it comes into the more you play the game, the more you'll get knowledgeable with them. Problem is, there are some vehicles that do look the same, in particular the American Sherman tanks, which we'll get to as we go along, but they are probably the biggest ones to confuse between when there is a medium tank and a heavy tank for the Americans, because they are technically 2 different types of the same tank. But we'll get into that. But we're going to start off with the recon tanks first. Recon tanks are essentially very lightly armed and lightly armored wheeled vehicles that can move very fast and do essentially reconnaissance work and engage light targets. However, they're not exactly built to withstand punishment. And here we have the M8 Greyhound recon tank. From there we have the German Puma recon tank. After that we have the Soviet Union's BA-10 recon tank. And last, we have the Daimler British recon tank. Now, unfortunately, I did not have a 360-degree view of the tank because getting these maps on console is kind of tough, so I do apologize for that. The next tank up from the recon tank is the light tank. These are also fairly light vehicles. They are tracked vehicles. They can take a little bit more punishment than the recon tank, but they're still mostly just used for light assault. And what you see in front of you is the American M5A1 Stuart light tank. For the Germans, you have the Panzer II Lux light tank, a light tank with a 20mm autocannon that can fire numerous rounds in one go, and does not have a driver's machine gun compared to the American light tank, the Stuart. The Soviet Union light tank is the T-70 light tank, armed with a 45mm anti-tank gun. Also, like the Lux, does not have a hull machine gun. For the British, you have the Tetrach light tank. Now, I do know that the Stuart M3 light tank will be eventually coming for the British faction, but for now, we still have the Tetrach. It mounts a 40mm 2-pounder gun with no hull-mounted machine gun. The next vehicle you'll probably see a lot of in combat is the medium tank. A nice balance of firepower, mobility, and armor. It can take some hits and dish out some as well. And what you see in front of you is the American M4 Sherman medium tank. For the Germans, they have the Panzer IV medium tank. For the Soviet Union, you have the T-34 medium tank. And for the British, you have the Cromwell medium tank. The last type of tank we need to talk about is the heavy tanks, and there's actually a fair number of them across all 4 countries in the game, and some countries have 2 of them. The Americans and Germans have 2 heavy tanks, while the British and Soviet Union only have 1 heavy tank that the commander can deploy. So, with that, let's start off talking about the American heavies, because they share the most similarity with their medium tank brother. So what you have in front of you is the Sherman Jumbo 75mm, and basically, it looks very similar to the medium tank, but with a couple differences. The overall armor is a lot better across all its sides, but the cannon is exactly the same found on the medium tank, a 75mm cannon. Compare this now to the Sherman Jumbo 76 that you have in front of you now, with a longer barrel and a muzzle brake at the end of it, the only American tank with a muzzle brake at the end of the barrel. This combines heavy armor with a heavy tank gun, and has everything you need in a heavy tank. But it looks very similar to the other vehicles. Now that we've talked about the Americans, let's talk about the Germans and their 2 heavy tanks, starting with the Panther. Arguably the best tank in the game. It has really nice sloped frontal armor, a nice squared off turret, and can move at very decent speeds, better than any other heavy tank on the battlefield. But the Panther isn't the only good heavy tank that the Germans get in-game. They also get the infamous Tiger I heavy tank. Its armor may be squared off, but it can take a lot of punishment. It's got a very circular turret compared to the Panther, and it's armed with a very deadly 88mm cannon. From there, we have the IS-1 heavy tank for the Soviet Union, the only heavy tank they get, and I have seen this tank mistaken for a T-34 medium tank. However, there are some major differences. The tank in general just has a different hull shape. It's more sloped off in some areas, it's got a wider turret, and it has a longer 85mm cannon in the turret. The last heavy tank to talk about, although I really stretch to call this thing a heavy tank, is the Sherman Firefly for the British. Essentially what it is a M4 medium tank hull from the Americans with a British 17-pounder or 76mm cannon in the turret. You can see a lot of similarities from the M4 Sherman's hull, but with a long-barreled cannon like the Sherman Jumbo 76 has. Now, in case you forgot or don't feel like really looking back at the video, I did make a vehicle chart for all of them. They may not be the best quality, but they're at least mine. Here's one for the US vehicles, one for the German vehicles, one for the Soviet Union vehicles, and one for the British vehicles. Above all else, I hope you learned something, learned about all the vehicles, or at least got a nice refresher, whatever you were here for. I do have a Discord server if you wish to join. I'll link something down below in the description. But thank you for your time watching, and I'll see you in the next video.